It's beautiful one day, it's perfect the next, this great state. The beaches, some of the world's best coral reefs, a land of contrasts and so rich in history. Nearly 2 million square kilometres of land rich in commodities for which the world seems to have an insatiable appetite. Compared with those around us, we're richer, our incomes are growing faster, and our export-oriented economy enables our government to invest relatively more than other governments in infrastructure and education. More and more people are voting with their feet. Already 1/3 of our population comes from across the border, bringing their skills, their enthusiasm, not to mention their capital, to invest in our success story. Yet there's a sense of foreboding as we come to grips with an unsettling reality. We're more exposed than other parts of the world to the looming threat of climate change. The projected increase in global temperatures of perhaps 6 degrees by this century's end could devastate natural assets that we hold dear, along with our agricultural base and our growing tourism industry, not to mention our water supplies. Lucrative and reliable as fossil fuel exports have been, generating income and jobs for our citizens, we know deep down that change is coming. As pressure to reduce greenhouse pollution intensifies, we know that 10 years from now, any state that exports 1 billion tonnes of CO2 a year will suffer political consequences for it. Hence all the forward planning, gas-fired electricity expansion and large-scale renewable energy projects, hence the deliberate government plan to diversify our economy in the years ahead, to plan beyond the dig-it-up, ship-it-out dependence on emission-intensive commodities, anticipating a carbon-constrained global economy. And as difficult as that transition will be, the sooner we start, the better. Because we know that a cleaner, greener economy is ultimately in the interests of a smart state. And that wouldn't be possible without the foresight, leadership and personal engagement to the task of the Premier, His Majesty the King. Oh, I'm sorry. Some of you probably thought I was talking about Queensland, not the state of Saudi Arabia. Things are quite different, I'm afraid to say, back in the so-called smart state. Sure, Queensland and Saudi Arabia have their similarities, about the same size, equally vulnerable, if not more so, to the impacts of climate change, and we too depend on fossil fuel exports. Our per capita greenhouse gas emissions are among the world's highest, and our population is growing faster than those around us. The other big similarity is that at some point between now and 2030, as their oil exports decline and our coal exports expand, Saudi Arabia and Queensland will both be exporting about 1 billion tonnes of CO2 annually. The two big differences are that in Queensland there is no sense of foreboding and no diversification away from fossil fuels, on the contrary. Whereas the reality of peak oil is setting in Riyadh, in Brisbane there's a faith verging on fundamentalism that coal will meet most of the world's energy needs, not just this century, perhaps beyond. Our Premier has even gone so far as to publicly guarantee that a green solution to coal will be found. Here, when it comes to coal exports, environmental protection is more about protecting the Great Barrier Reef from the occasional coal spill, rather than protecting the climate from the emissions caused should the coal ship actually reach its intended destination. Here, when a coal baron announces his intention to export another 40 million tonnes of coal annually, the Premier shares the stage, while he's suing her, mind you, to announce it and lauds it as great news. Here, unlike the Saudis, we're increasing our reliance on fossil fuels, not diversifying away from them. Here, state-owned railway companies brag in television ads that they carry 500,000 tonnes of coal on the average day, as if it's a good thing to add more greenhouse gas pollution daily than 300,000 cars do yearly. Here, the government's Climate Smart Leadership Award is sponsored by a company whose offshore coal mining produces more CO2 each year than the states of Western Australia, South Australia and Victoria combined. So while the Saudis are coming to terms with a new reality, here we see no reason even to acknowledge one. To our government's way of thinking, Queensland is on a winner with coal and our economy is having a blinder. We already see coal as the state's economic backbone, the benefactor whose generous royalties fund much of what government provides. We're in the early days of a 30-year supercycle boom and sitting on 33 billion tonnes of coal, so it's full steam ahead. Securing prosperity for Queensland in the years ahead is seemingly not about doing things differently, but about doing a great deal more of what we do right now. And on that basis, the Queensland Government is 100% behind the coal industry's plans to double exports from this state in the next decade or so. New coal mines and coal seam gas wells are being approved across much of the state right now. Under prime Darling Downs agricultural land, aquifers and rivers at the headwaters of the Murray-Darling Basin, whole towns are being abandoned and swallowed. Nearly 1,000 new kilometres of railway track is being added to carry coal. New ports are being built, with a large share of the infrastructure being funded by the Queensland and federal governments. We've seen our fair share of mining rushes in Queensland, but never one like this. Counterintuitive as it may seem to external observers, there's no hint that the Queensland Government sees any contradiction between being climate smart and doubling the CO2 it exports in its coal. We show not a hint of embarrassment as we ignore scientists like James Hansen when they warn us that agreement to phase out coal use, except where the CO2 is captured, is 80% of the solution to the global warming crisis. Far from it. Since we take for granted that coal will be cleaned up in due course, we don't even see the emissions in our coal exports as a problem. And since they count in the country that burns the coal, they're certainly not seen as our problem. Queensland is concerned with emissions occurring within its borders, and it's mostly relying on a federally imposed carbon price to deal with that problem. On these grounds, the emissions generated by our coal exports, our biggest contribution to climate change by far, are completely ignored in the state's official climate change strategy. The 424-page-long document Climate Q Towards a Greener Queensland, released last year and dubbed by the Premier as the government's main weapon against the massive global threat of climate change, does not mention coal export emissions once. Instead, the focus is on dispelling the idea that individual action makes no difference, with a host of climate-smart programs aimed at proving that consumers and businesses and government agencies all working together can cumulatively help move Queensland towards a low-carbon future. From every angle, it seems, everyone's being offered a government incentive to green up their act. The sheer number of people being mobilised is impressive, as are the greenhouse emission savings. Whether it's solar hot water on another 200,000 roofs, 1 million energy-efficient light bulbs being given away, 74,000 Queenslanders signing up for what's being called the Bligh government's low-carbon diet, and over 250,000 Queenslanders taking advantage of the climate-smart home service in search of emission cuts in the house. And the government's doing its bit just as eagerly, offsetting its official travel and government vehicles, with the plan being to offset all government buildings and vehicles by the year 2020. Meanwhile, fossil fuel-based generation is being cleaned up with a 15% gas requirement, funding for clean coal projects and low emission conditions for any new coal-fired power stations. Also, the government now requires that proposals to it come with a climate change impact statement. The action is even more frenetic on the renewable energy front, with the plan being to double Queensland's solar energy use in the next few years. Visitors to the city are already greeted on the road in from the airport with billboards welcoming them to the solar state. And seemingly everyone is getting involved to justify that claim that Queensland is the solar state and that it's doing the right thing as the catch cry goes. There are solar kindies, solar schools, solar sporting and community associations, solar railway stations, solar cities. And thanks in part to the Queensland Government help, the state has its first solar farm, and the first solar coal hybrid power station is on its way, as is the largest photovoltaic rooftop array in Australia, which will turn the University of Queensland into the solar university. Home by home, school by school, street by street, city by city, as the ads put it, A virtual 500 megawatt solar power station is being created in Queensland. The sheer magnitude of public involvement makes it hard not to imagine that some sort of green revolution is sweeping the state. And it would seem that Queensland is on track to achieve the seemingly bold climate-smart aim to reduce the carbon footprint of Queenslanders by 1/3 by the year 2020. So, does Queensland have the winning formula? Are we actually showing to the world that the world's biggest coal exporting state can also be clean and green? Well, as with most things that sound too good to be true, this is too. What's missing is the context. When we hear government say that it aims to cut the carbon footprint of Queenslanders by 1/3, it sounds to most people as if Queensland's carbon footprint is being cut by 1/3. Some by government ministers, including the Climate Change Minister, even seem to believe that if you read their press statements. Yet, as ever, the devil is in the detail. The target actually applies to the emissions of Queensland households, which are only 16% of the state's emissions total, or roughly 1/6. So we're really talking about cutting less than 1/6 of our emissions by 1/3. Hence, as laudable as it is for Queenslanders to cut their emissions by 1/3, it actually has very little impact on the state's overall carbon footprint. Householders are busily doing their bit and no doubt feeling justifiably greener for it, but the state's carbon footprint is growing in spite of all their efforts. And if we factor in the projected growth by the year 2020, and that's the year to which the target actually applies, it soon becomes apparent that it's hard to argue that Queensland is in fact doing the right thing. By 2020, its emissions are still much higher than today. And by 2050, unless there's a major policy shift, they will be at least 30% higher than today. And that's before we even start factoring in the emissions generated by Queensland's growing coal exports. But before we do that, let's have a closer look at that export industry. Australia is the undisputed king of the global seaborne coal trade. Australia produces around 1/3 of the world's coal exports. We provide half of the metallurgical coal exports for steelmaking. Only Indonesia comes close to Australia, and Australian companies mine more than 1/3, between 1/3 and a half of Indonesian exports as well. Australian companies play a similarly prominent role in the fastest growing coal exporting nations as well, places like Mongolia and Mozambique. Producing 2/3 of Australia's coal exports, Queensland is to the Australian coal industry what the Australian coal industry is to the global trade, the mothership. To truly grasp the enormity of the carbon in our coal exports, consider that the 167.9 million metric tonnes that we export annually generates 453 million tonnes of CO2, which is more than 2.5 times the greenhouse pollution generated inside Queensland's borders. Those ships carrying Queensland coal abroad can carry up to 250,000 tonnes of coal. Once burnt, that coal has roughly the same CO2 impact as 160,000 cars do over a year. If we take 80,000 tonnes as the average load on a ship, one leaves a Queensland coal port every 4 hours. Those trains you see heading towards the port, extending for well over 1 kilometre, routinely pull 100 wagons at a time, with each wagon containing 100 tonnes of coal or 270 tonnes of CO2. If we take these numbers as an average, over 16,700 trains arrive at our ports every year, 46 a day, one every 32 minutes. Break that down further, and Queensland exports over 5 tonnes of coal a second, 100 tonnes of CO2 every 7 seconds, and put another way, we export the average annual emissions of a Queensland household every single second. The pace at which coal exports are growing is equally daunting, with another 1 million tonnes or roughly 15 new shiploads every month. At the rate our coal exports are increasing, Queensland is effectively adding a large new coal-fired power station or steel mill somewhere in the world about every 6 weeks. This helps to put into proper perspective all the climate-smart campaigns and all the talk of doing the bright thing and turning Queensland into a solar state. So, for example, if we imagine all the effort involved in 420 solar kindies around the state, installing solar power. The time, the cost, the labour, the paperwork, the young hearts and minds, all inspired. All of that greenhouse pollution cut is added back by just 3.5 extra wagons of coal exports. Imagine the excitement, the passion of the kids and staff at over 750 schools across the state, installing solar energy and energy-efficient light bulbs, thanks to the Solar Schools program. How would the kids feel knowing that their CO2 saving is wiped out by less than one trainload of coal? Then there's the Solar University of Queensland, the biggest solar rooftop array in the country. The CO2 that will be saved annually will be erased by just 6.5 more wagons of coal. As for what is being billed as the largest solar thermal project in the Southern Hemisphere, which is being tacked on to the existing coal-fired power station at Kogan Creek, that's expected to save enough electricity annually to power 5,000 homes. And that's a saving that's wiped out by 4 trainloads of coal, something that happens roughly every 2 hours. Let's add in all the other incentives for solar hot water, solar grants to sports and community associations, the solar Carrara Stadium, even solar panels at Queensland rail stations. If it all adds up to a 500 megawatt virtual solar power station, doubling Queensland's use of solar energy might save 1 million tonnes of coal annually. And that sounds pretty good until you realise that we're increasing coal exports by more than 1 million tonnes every single month. As for the government offsetting its official travel, well, the CO2 saving there is erased by 1 trainload of coal. That's roughly equivalent to pausing the state's coal exports for 37 minutes. Giving out 1 million energy-efficient light bulbs erased by 3 trainloads of coal. Just imagine the effort involved, the bureaucracy involved in distributing 1 million energy-efficient light bulbs. It's the equivalent of pausing our coal exports for 90 minutes. As for what it took 74,000 Queenslanders to achieve by signing up to the Bligh government's low-carbon diet, the CO2 saved there is packed on by increasing coal exports in just 2 weeks. The CO2 saved by 260,000 Queenslanders using the Climate Smart Home service erased in 7.5 weeks by increasing coal exports. You get the idea. If the government succeeds in cutting the carbon footprint of Queensland householders by 1/3 by 2020, it will save 10.1 million tonnes of CO2 a year. But keep this in mind. Queensland exports that much CO2 in its coal every 8.5 days. And at the rate the exports are growing, it takes less than 100 days of new coal exports to erase what it will take Queenslanders a decade to cut their carbon footprint by 1/3. Put another way, 1 new 12 million tonne a year coal mine in central Queensland, which is happening, the Claremont mine, will on its own produce 3 times as much CO2 as the Climate Smart householder emission savings by 2020 put together. Now, if you get onto Google Earth and you zoom in on a coal stockpile at a Queensland port, depending on how hungry you are, it starts to resemble an enormous block of very dark chocolate. And that's only fitting amidst all the talk about the Bligh government's low-carbon diet. Because in a way, coal exports are the government's favourite high-carbon treat. And the battle between Anna Bligh's big chocolate bar and the low-carbon dieting is no contest. For example, during the time it will take me to deliver this presentation, the plan to cut Queenslanders' carbon footprint by 1/3 will save 100 tonnes of CO2 or so. Yet over the same 50 to 60 minute period, sorry, it will take that long, another 4,000 tonnes of CO2 will be added just through the increase in coal exports from Queensland. In short, the Bligh government's high-carbon diet is about 40 times as effective as its low-carbon diet. And to do justice to the sheer brazenness of the claim that the solar state is being climate smart, we need to factor in those export emissions. For those who don't have superhuman eyesight, I've included a little magnifying glass so you can still see what cutting Queenslanders' carbon footprint by 1/3 by 2020 actually means, that little green bit. Now let's factor in a doubling of coal exports over the next decade as sought by industry and supported by the government. Let's then factor in the 140 million tonnes of CO2 on top of that would be generated by a 50 million tonne a year LNG export industry, which the government also aspires to. Queensland is then a greenhouse ghetto a decade from now, between its own emissions and the CO2 exports in its fossil fuels, generating roughly 1.1 billion tonnes of CO2 annually, nearly twice as much as Australia does currently, and not much less than Saudi Arabia exports in its petroleum right now. And just to illustrate that point, here are Saudi Arabia's CO2 exports today compared with ours in 2020. Maybe the billboard on the road in from the airport should read, "Welcome to Queensland, Saudi Arabia of the South Pacific." Or perhaps the Premier should just have this number plate attached to her official car. Oh, and in case you're wondering how we can become the Saudi Arabia of the South Pacific when we've also consolidated our position as the solar state by doubling solar energy use, well, counting solar hot water, which the government does, about 6% of Queensland's electricity capacity comes from renewable sources, about 1.2% from solar. And because solar is starting with such a tiny share, and because electricity demand in Queensland is set to increase by 55%, doubling our solar energy use has very little impact. By 2020, around 4% of electricity capacity would come from solar, and the so-called solar state would remain overwhelmingly dependent on fossil fuels. Now you have the context required to see the climate smart and solar state branding clearly. While the Queensland public has been busily cutting their carbon footprint, the Bligh government is increasing the state's carbon footprint as if climate change isn't even happening. Once you appreciate this, you won't be surprised to learn that the government is spending more than 13 times as much on infrastructure to expand coal exports as the $1.4 billion it is spending to fight climate change. You won't be surprised to hear that in spite of over 150 climate change impact statements being prepared, not one coal mine or emission-intensive project has been prevented from proceeding because of its emissions impact. Nor will you be surprised to learn that the new conditions on new coal-fired power station, hailed as a ban on conventional coal-fired power, amount to anything but a ban. Ostensibly, they require new coal-fired power stations to capture their emissions or to be capture ready, I should say, and hooked up within 5 years of the technology becoming commercially viable. Yet the fine print says that the conditions don't apply if the power station is linked to a major project that might go to a developing country where no comparable restriction exists. In practice, there are about 150 such countries, and that very dynamic applies in most new resource projects in Australia. And even if the project being considered for Queensland is not genuinely in competition with an alternative developing country destination, companies are extremely good at pretending otherwise, and having helped a major mining company do just that in a previous life to win government support here, I can vouch for that. Even though it sounds nice, in practice, the new conditions on coal-fired power are no significant obstacle to new dirty coal-fired power stations.